Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Natalie Valentin, and today we're going to talk about something that is both deeply clinical and deeply human, supporting all ways to feed. This presentation is really about how we support families, not just with education, but with compassion, language, and emotional safety. This is what families remember most. It's how they felt after we connected. I'm speaking to you from multiple lenses. I'm speaking to you as a nurse, as a leader, as someone who provides lactation support, honestly, as a mom. I have definitely experienced the guilt, the pressure, the identity shift, and the feeling of wondering if what I was doing was right. That experience really changed how I lead and how I teach, because no family deserves to feel shame while trying to care for someone that they love. Here we go. This is one of my favorite reframes. Most of us grow up learning the golden rule, or we've heard it before: you treat others the way you would want to be treated. And that matters. It really does. Well, in healthcare and in family support, the platinum rule, that matters even more. Treat others the way they need to be treated. I learned about the platinum rule between the birth of my sister-in-law's first and second babies. For her first delivery, she called me when she went into labor. We ended up meeting at the hospital, and I was so ready. I offered hand holding and ice chips. I offered counter pressure, music. I offered to dance, anything I could think of. And what she asked of me was to leave. Yes, you heard that correctly. She asked me to leave. She asked me to leave and go stay with her senior dog and told me she would call me once the baby was born. And needless to say, I was absolutely horrified. I'm a nurse, I'm a mom. How was my support not welcomed? Well, it turns out what I want during labor or postpartum or in most aspects of or any time that I might need support, it's different than what she wants. I was totally overwhelming for her. When she went into labor for her second child, we lived in the same community, the same neighborhood. We could walk to each other's house without ever stepping off of a sidewalk. And the day she went into labor, I was home. And she called me. We walked together. We walked the block in silence. She held my shoulder when she needed to lean or squeeze. And when she went to the hospital, I stayed home with her firstborn son and their dog. And the next day, she called me and asked me to come up so that we could meet their baby. I was welcomed. I was helpful. I showed up for her as exactly what she needed. Because support isn't about what makes sense to us, it's about what helps other people feel safe. So when we're supporting others, we need to lead with their preferences. Because if we lead with ours, we might miss the mark completely. So, this is how we're looking at feeding today. Feeding is not a simple task, feeding is a full human experience. I want to add some research here because there was a study done back a few years ago, and formula feeding mothers in the UK found that the vast majority of those mothers experience guilt, stigma, and a need to defend their feeding choices. Many of those moms reported feeling judged by healthcare professionals. So the emotional weight of feeding decisions isn't limited to any one method. It is universal. Can you think of a time that you were sitting with a parent? Maybe there was something that they said and it just didn't sit well. And not only did it not sit well, you didn't know how to respond. If we were to truly think about this, what might we want to do different? And if we're being really honest, how did we handle it in the moment? This might be a good moment to write something down. Write that thing down that someone said to you, and you thought, gosh, I don't feel great about that. And I don't know what to say. So we'll write that down and then we'll come back to it later. Am I doing this right? This is one of the most common questions that we hear. We hear this question as nurses, as women, as medical professionals. We may hear it as friends, as family, as neighbors. I mean, quite frankly, you may hear this as a person next to another person in a grocery store because someone is so desperate for help. Because on the surface, it sounds like a feeding question. But most of the time, it's really not. A lot of the times, it's not even about feeding. It's about someone saying, am I enough? Am I failing? Am I missing something? Am I already getting this wrong? Because that question, am I already getting this wrong, really carries a lot of pressure. Am I doing this right? Carries identity, fear. And often it's carrying the weight of wanting to do something really, really well, especially for someone they love. So this is where our work begins. Our work begins with correction. No, it does not. Our work begins with connection, not correction. So, as we mentioned before, when someone is asking, am I doing this right? It may not be about feeding, right? We talked about it could be a variety of other things: fear, identity, desire, concern. Sometimes the hardest part of feeding isn't feeding at all. It's what they're carrying when they're trying to do it. So it's what parents are carrying while they're trying to feed. Are they carrying guilt? Maybe for what didn't go quite as planned, or for what they had to change, because change is hard. Is it for what they think they should have done differently? And I hope you heard a shift in my tone there because I used some air quotes there for should. We'll come back to that one later too. How about shame? Because feeding becomes tied to identity so quickly. So let's pause on that for a second. Feeding becomes tied to identity, and shame is quiet. So it may not announce itself. It often doesn't. Mom may say, I'm fine. Dad may say, I'm fine. Everybody's fine. And somehow it's possible that nobody's really feeling fine. They may have a lot of fear. They may fear harming their baby. They may fear failure. They may fear judgment from family, friends, work, the hospital staff, society, the internet, social media. And then on top of that, we'll go ahead and add a little bit of self doubt. It's that quiet voice that's asking, am I going to be good at this? Am I going to be enough? Because maybe I'm not. And that weight is real. So, what we have to remember is that when we're walking into that room, we're not carrying any of this. We're not carrying any of their guilt, any of their fear, any of their identity. We're not carrying their desire to do well. We're walking into that room ready to give them information or education, hopefully to support them. And we need to pause because they are carrying all of it. They are carrying all the fear, all the weight, the, the question about their identity. They're carrying a desire to do well so strong, so deep, so big that it is almost overwhelming. There's another research study that was just done in 2021, and it found that guilt and shame around infant feeding are strongly linked to self-perception, and many moms that struggle with feeding identify themselves as a bad mother. I mean, that is so heavy. These emotions are not fleeting. right? These are going to shape how the parents are engaging with their baby, with their support, how they're bonding with their baby, with each other, and whether or not they seek help. Because in a follow-up study with that same group a few years later, guilt and shame were significant predictors of postpartum anxiety and depression. That is heavy. So before we talk about what we need to do differently or what needs to shift, I want to say this clearly, okay? We absolutely are showing up with good intentions, right? When we're showing up to support someone, whether that's in the hospital, in the home, on the phone, in a lactation support group, in a virtual support group, wherever it is, most of the time we are showing up with good intentions, right? We care deeply. We want to educate them because we want to help them arrive in the best place possible, right? We want the best outcomes for them. We are trying to help. We are trying to help. So this isn't about blame. It's about awareness. Because sometimes, even with the best intentions, our words, us, the support team, may accidentally create pressure. So when what someone really needed was safety, we came in and made it more challenging for them. So again, this is not about guilt. This is not about blame. We want to recognize that when we know, we grow. So recognizing that we may accidentally create pressure when what someone needed was safety is exactly where growth starts. This is a big one. Feeding does not exist in one perfect lane. It exists on a spectrum, right? Is someone going to breastfeed? Are they going to bottle feed? Is there some combination of feeding? Will they be pumping? Will they be pumping and then they are feeding with the bottle, or are they pumping and someone else is feeding with a bottle? Sometimes all of these things happen in the same week. I mean, if we're being really honest, sometimes all of these options, breast, bottle, combo, pumping, happen in the same day. So too often we end up creating this hierarchy that says one is better than the other. And if you didn't do the better option, you didn't choose the better option, you weren't successful with the better option, then you failed. And while that is never our intention, and hopefully nobody has ever said those words, that unintentional hierarchy is suggesting that if you don't succeed in breastfeeding, then you have failed. And many families are not looking for perfection. They're looking for what works. In the real world, they're looking for what's sustainable, what is safe, what is protecting the baby and the parent. Yes, breast is best. If mom is so exhausted that she is falling asleep with her baby at her breast because she is absolutely guilt-stricken and feels like she can't possibly ask for help and nobody else can feed her baby because any other method of feeding would be failing, well, then that baby is at risk for some type of sleep tragedy or even worse. And we don't want to encourage that. There is no shame in flexibility. We want to find support in flexibility. No hierarchy, no judgment. In 2024, Wheeler is a professor at a university here in the States, and they found that the perceived pressures around infant feeding are significantly associated with poor maternal mental health outcomes. Because when parents feel pushed towards one feeding method, the stress response can undermine both feeding success and bonding. It's not about does it need to be breast versus bottle. What we're trying to encourage is that combination feeding is common. and we want to reflect the reality in most families. There was another study that discussed the pressure that parents feel when having to choose or lean toward a specific feeding method. So rather than accepting that combination feeding is not only very common, but may actually be the most helpful, there's this idea that you have to choose either breast or bottle. So here, this is where we're thinking about the shift, right? The shift is rethinking feeding so that feeding is not a performance, it's an experience. It's not a scorecard. It's not a pass or fail exam. We're trying to move from a completed action to what does this feel like for you? What are you carrying? What support do you need? When we're thinking about the words we're choosing, our body language, how we're showing up, are we supporting them? Or is this pressure? Is this pressure to prove? Is this pressure to be perfect? What we want instead, what support looks like, is more partnering, more permission, and really thinking about breastfeeding as that journey, as that experience. So we shift from outcome to connection. Because long after people separate, after we part ways, they're not going to remember the exact advice we gave. They're going to remember how supported they felt. And that honestly matters just as much. So now we're moving into the part of our support that may go unspoken. And it's not necessarily our support, it's what exists underneath the space where mom says, I need help with feeding, or dad says, mom needs help with feeding, or dad says, I need help. We need help. It's the guilt, the shame, the pressure, and the language that quietly shapes all of it. Because again, feeding is rarely just about feeding. It becomes that identity, the expectations, worth. And sometimes it becomes a space, a place where people decide, am I enough? This is where they create that evidence that they decide to believe, or they're able to believe that they are enough. So if we're not careful, our words may not create safety. And instead, they may add to that weight. That's where we're going next. Because words can create pressure or they can create safety. And this is not my opinion. Well, I do believe this. This is what research shows. In a 2024 study published in Maternal and Child Nutrition, Jackson and colleagues surveyed 880, nope. In a 2024 study published in Maternal and Child Nutrition, Jackson and colleagues surveyed 876 mothers and found that guilt and shame around infant feeding significantly predicted postnatal anxiety and depression. The pathway was clear. High perceived pressure to breastfeed and poor healthcare professional support increased guilt and shame, which then drove anxiety and depression rates through the roof. And in a separate study by Gertan and colleagues, a group of postpartum mothers were followed over time, and they found that perceived pressure to breastfeed was associated with increased anxiety, stress, and even birth trauma symptoms 4 weeks later. Not immediately, 4 weeks later. 4 weeks after birth, that pressure lingered. There are so many studies. There are so many facts. There are so many spaces where we can gather this information, and we're often not slipping in the words we choose because we don't have the information. It's knowing what to do with it. There are many mothers who intend to breastfeed, but then switch to formula. And those moms will often report a higher level of guilt. They report that they feel there is a stigma against how they're feeding, and they need to defend their feeding choices. They feel like they need to defend their feeding choices. So in addition to growing and birthing a tiny human, bringing life into this world, they're now feeling bad about how they are feeding the baby. And they're feeling like they need to defend themselves. So this is why our language matters. This is why how we show up matters, because this isn't just opinion. This is research that tells us that the way we deliver support directly impacts mental health outcomes, not just feeding outcomes, mental health. Before we can ever give any kind of education, we're creating this environment. So I mentioned this previously, that words can create pressure or words can create safety. So what we say and how we say matters. Before we ever give any kind of education, we create the environment, right? We're creating the space, we're building the space. And that environment is built through language. Many of us have heard about language that is more than verbal. It's not only the words we use. It's the words we use, the tone that we use, and then those nonverbal communication cues. So body language, tone, the shift, the way that we make faces, right? So yes, what we say matters, and how we say it matters even more. It's the timing, it's the pause, it's the way that we communicate in a big picture and not only our words, because people may forget our exact words, but they are going to remember how those words made them feel. I have spoken about this many times and in many spaces. Should, the word should, it's used casually, it sounds harmless. I want to be clear that the word should carries weight. The weight of should is anchored by blame or shame or guilt. New parents, moms, anyone that you've ever met might say, well, I should be able to, or I should feel differently, right? I should be breastfeeding. I should be handling this better. Every one of those shoulds creates pressure. And then that turns support into expectation, and then expectation into shame. So there's no need to should all over ourselves, okay? And we definitely don't need to should all over new parents, because shoulding is not helpful. When someone is carrying all of those internal shoulds, they often stop saying what they really need. So they'll stop saying, gosh, I feel like I'm failing, or I feel like I'm not enough, or I feel like my body is letting me down, because that is a very vulnerable place. Those are vulnerable words. So instead, they share the safer version. They'll share the surface version, the easier thing to say out loud. So that's where we have to listen differently, because sometimes what sounds like a feeding problem is really a shame problem, which takes us here. Have you ever said something to someone and the message in your mind or the message that you wrote down landed so differently to the person receiving the message that you thought, oh my goodness, that is not what I said. I don't know how you heard that thing. Well, that's about meaning, the meaning that we make from words. And it goes both ways. We may say something and someone else makes a different meaning of those words. For the purpose of this space, what we want to identify is that sometimes what we hear, sometimes what a mom says, a new mom, a new dad, a new parent says is not the same as the meaning behind the words. So the words we hear is not the message that is actually being said. When someone says, I'm not making enough milk, what they may be saying is, "Ugh, I feel like my body is failing me." When someone says, well, I had to supplement, they may be thinking, I think I did something wrong. And when someone says, I don't like breastfeeding, there are usually many layers of what happens beyond that, because I don't like breastfeeding may mean I'm overwhelmed, I'm exhausted, I feel trapped. And obviously, those words are very different, but the meaning underneath those words, it all comes from those quiet shoulds, because someone should be able to do this. They should be better. They shouldn't need help. So, yes, we want to listen. And yes, we do want to hear the words. We also want to make sure that we are responding to the meaning behind the words shared. Because if we are only answering the surface words, then we may miss the real need underneath. We may not even identify it. So in this space, and I want to be clear here that while yes, this is about families, this is about humans. This is about men and women and children and senior citizens and the employed and the unemployed. And this is everyone. What if we gave families permission to stop trying to do things this perfectly? What if success wasn't about checking every single box, and instead it was about showing up? What if success was literally doing the best that they can with the resources they have on the day that they are having? Because we all know that some days are better than others. Some days the bar is a little bit higher, right? Flexibility is not failure. Neither is changing the plan, which means that supplementing with formula is not failure. Asking for help is also not failure. Support is meant to reduce shame, not create it. So sometimes being present matters more than being perfect. So when we land here, when we think about being present versus being perfect, when we think about words and the should and mental health versus feeding, I want to be clear that the weight of breast is best is heavy. So what I'm about to say, I want to say clearly that this is a shift that I have embraced. So I'm not going to say we have all shifted, because I understand that many of us still sit in the space where breast is best, right? And then fed is best is settling. I'm in this space and I say that I have shifted because lived experience changes perspective. I have felt the guilt and the pressure. I have felt the quiet shame that comes with feeding that doesn't look the way someone expects it to look. Breast is best can feel heavy, and fed is best can feel like settling, like a consolation prize or second place. And no mother is less than, no mother is second place just because feeding didn't go according to plan. I say this and want to share that I am a mom. I said that early on. I have 3 children. My first 2 children, I was able to produce a ton of breast milk. I didn't hesitate. I didn't have issues. I had milk. I was filling bottles in the hospital. I mean, before I even left, I had so much milk, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I was meant to do this. I'm going to be a great mom, blah, blah, blah. And I nursed my first baby until he was a little over a year. And then I saved some milk in the freezer so that I could mix it with some solid foods and or I could give it to him if he wasn't feeling well. 6 years later, I did the same thing with my second baby. So much milk. I mean, I couldn't even believe it. I just had so much milk. And this baby was, my second baby was a little bit bigger than my first baby, and I still had so much milk. I did the same thing. I actually nursed him a little bit longer than a year. We were, I think, around 13 or 14 months. And I mean, I nursed, I pumped, I stored, it was amazing. I had so much milk. And then I had my third baby, my darling little rainbow baby who came after many struggles. And he was challenging. He was born the exact same weight, the exact same length, and the exact same gestation as my second baby. And once he came out, there was nothing different. I mean, nothing the same. Everything was different. My third baby at 4 months, when he cut his first tooth, was the same size as my first baby at 1 year. So breastfeeding wasn't going well. I wasn't making enough milk. I was also 10 years older from my first to my third. Life was different. My body was different. This baby was very different. And I ended up needing to supplement. And I felt absolutely terrible, awful, horrible about myself. I felt like a failure. I wanted so bad to have this baby, and maybe it just wasn't, maybe I was forcing something. I don't know. I had all these thoughts. And then I gave him formula, and then he seemed like he was a happier baby. And once I got past, or at least tried to move through some of my guilt, he started to sleep a little better. And while he was an enormous child at 1 year old, he was healthy and he was happy and he slept a little bit. And I had to really gauge what it looked like to be in a space of acceptance, because I didn't feel like I was doing anything right. My air quotes again. I didn't feel like I was doing it right. I didn't feel like I was enough. I didn't feel like I was even being a good mom, because I couldn't show up the way I did for my first two, specifically regarding feeding. So, what are some words that might be helpful? And this comes from a something called motivational interviewing. It comes from a lot of different evidence-based practices, whether it's home visiting or in the hospital. And I will tell you that these are words that could have changed so many things about how I received change, or how I accepted that things were different. I didn't understand that flexibility was okay. And I didn't know how to say, I need help, because what I heard was not tell me more. What I heard was, here's what you should do. So, 3 phrases that will open the door and hopefully lower guards, right? In a space where someone is incredibly vulnerable already, saying something like, tell me more, is so much more helpful than, here's what you should do. You're not alone in this. Somebody sit with me. Tell me I'm not alone, right? Tell me I'm not alone because I'm feeling like I'm struggling. New moms are feeling like they're struggling, and isolation makes everything heavier. And sometimes they just need to know that they're not the only one. A lot of people want to hear, oh, how are you feeling? How's the baby? How's the baby sleeping? Is everybody eating? Is everybody drinking? Is everybody doing all the things? And that again, it seems so nice. And honestly, are you doing okay? Yeah, everybody says yes to that, right? Because nobody wants to be vulnerable. New moms don't want to be vulnerable. So, one of the most helpful questions might be, what's been the hardest thing about sleeping or feeding or about being a new mom or a new dad? What's been the hardest part about this change for your relationship? What's been the hardest part about fill in the blank? Because that question is going to open real conversation. And then that's where we can move in and support. When we think about how we're going to show up and how we're going to support, it comes down to emotional safety, right? Someone wants to feel confident, they likely lack it. So if they feel safe, then they may have more trust. They may have more trust in themselves, in their body. They may have more trust in us. They may have more trust in their ability to figure things out, which, if they have the confidence and they have the trust, they may feel like, okay, well, maybe this feeding thing isn't so huge that I can't figure it out, because stress changes things and shame rarely improves outcomes. So if they have the trust and they have the confidence, and then they're able to feed their baby, they're able to bond with their baby even better. Because if every feeding feels like failure, then that relationship is starting under pressure. And that matters. It's connected. These aren't all separate pieces. This is one full experience. There are there's there was another study done in 2022, and 1 in 3 women experienced their birth as traumatic. 36% of those women developed full postpartum PTSD. That's a lot. There's a sometimes up to 20%. This is from the City Birth Trauma Scales Policy Center, estimates that 20% of women report clinically significant birth-related PTSD symptoms. So again, when we have feeding difficulties that overlap with birth trauma, emotional stakes multiply. So creating emotional safety isn't a soft skill. This is clinically imperative. So as providers, as support staff, support people, family members, work colleagues, whatever it is, this is where we want to work really hard to think about that perspective and shift, right? This is another shift from judgment to curiosity. So she didn't care. It seemed like she didn't even care. Or it seemed like she wasn't even trying. I wonder if she might have been overwhelmed, right? I wonder if she was stuck. Because imagine caring about something so much that you almost feel paralyzed. Okay, has this ever happened to you? Maybe you make a to-do list, maybe your to-do list is in your head and you're like, okay, I have all these things I need to do. So, okay, I'm going to do, A and B and C and D, and you have this list. And somewhere between making that list and getting dressed or filling up your water, getting a coffee, something happens. There's a shift somewhere in your brain, in your body, and you sit down and You have 1,000 things to do, and you know that. And then you don't get up. Maybe you keep growing your list. Maybe you pick up your phone. Maybe you check an order. Maybe you check an email. Maybe you pop into social media. And instead of moving and working through our list, we're frozen, paralyzed, scrolling, shutting down. And not only are we stuck, not only are we feeling like we have so many things to do that we can't even move, now we're judging ourselves for it, right? Now we're judging ourselves. Oh my gosh, I can't believe how lazy I am. I can't believe I had all this stuff to do and I didn't do anything. I just sat here. I just sat here and didn't do anything. And then before you know it, it's been an hour and you haven't done anything. And now you're feeling bad about yourself. This is not a lack of care, right? This didn't happen because you don't care about yourself or you don't care about things. It's overload, right? You're stuck in survival. So when we're thinking about how we can support someone in this space, we want to really think about, where does our brain go? Are we judging them, or are we honestly allowing some curiosity to lead that interaction? Because I wonder if she was overwhelmed. I wonder if maybe she was just stuck, because that's where things change. That's where we can move in with some more of that support, because then we're not saying, oh my gosh, you didn't even care. We're saying, okay, I wonder if she's feeling so overwhelmed. I wonder how I can support her. We talked about PTSD. We talked about mental health. We talked about feeding, right? And we talked about how 1 in 3 women describe their birth experience as a traumatic event, right? Well, on top of that, feeding struggles can reactivate that birth trauma. So if approximately 1/3 of women are identifying their birth experience as traumatic, and then many of those women develop PTSD, likely undiagnosed. I mean, maybe more undiagnosed. We have to really think about the words we're using, how we're using them, and approaching this, pulling all our pieces together, thinking about trauma-informed feeding support. We talk a lot about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed feeding support, because birth is traumatic. Even if it's beautiful, it may be traumatic. And feeding can be traumatic, even if it's not really challenging. So making sure we're using language that will support this, that will support PTSD and postpartum depression, right? They're different approaches. They may occur simultaneously, but we want to make sure that what we're saying, how we're saying it, what we're listening to, what we're hearing, we're identifying the interactions and we're shaping them so that we're not trying to do more. We're trying to be more aware, right? Awareness of that tone, awareness of touch, awareness of power dynamics, awareness of what the person in front of you may have already been through. So when we sit with a mother who is struggling to feed, we may be sitting with someone whose body has already been through something traumatic. And feeding support that doesn't account for that is incomplete. So trauma-informed care isn't a separate skill. It's the foundation underneath everything that we do. This is where we begin again. Let's pause. Because sometimes we move so quickly into fixing, into solving, into doing, that we forget the most important part, which is presence. Showing up. Before the education, before the intervention, before the solutions, there's connection. There's trust. There's safety. That connection, that trust, that safety, that's not in perfection. It's not in having every answer. It's in how we show up. And sometimes that is the most powerful thing we can offer, presence. So I understand this is a lot to take in, and we're just about halfway through. So I want to just shake out your body for a second. Take a breath, sit up tall. If you want to stand up, you can stand up. Relax your shoulders. Maybe close your eyes. If you're standing, hold on to something. If you're sitting, sit up tall. Close your eyes. Relax your shoulders. Take a full breath, filling through the bottom part of your lungs. Breathe in through your nose and pause. And slowly exhale through your mouth, like you're blowing bubbles. And then let's do it again. So we're going to breathe in through your nose like you're smelling the most beautiful flower ever. Filling through the bottom of your lungs, your body is relaxed. Fill, 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 and then pause. Take a moment, and then exhale slowly through your mouth, again with the bubbles. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, adjust in your seat, because now we're moving into our role, right? It's not only what we teach, how we're showing up. So it's about feeding, it's about nursing, it's about leadership, trust. It's about supervision in a way that doesn't feel like we're judging, right? It's reflective, because support isn't only information, it's presence, it's trust. It's the feeling that someone leaves with when the visit is over, when the session is over, when the hospital appointment is over. This is where feeding support becomes bigger than feeding itself. This is where we can really care for someone when they're carrying something heavy. And sometimes this is the most powerful part of our job, because it's not what we say, it's how safe people feel saying things to us. So thinking about the first words, we talk about this with babies, right? Their first years, their first words. It's not only babies, right? What we say early on sticks. And even if we don't remember it, they do. And we think about this in like a first impression, right? You don't get to have a second chance in a first impression. So those first few conversations matter. Those first responses matter. The first moment that someone asks for help, that matters. And how you respond can shape the entire nature of what that relationship looks like moving forward. Because confidence is fragile, and especially during that postpartum period, especially when someone already feels uncertain. Sometimes one sentence builds trust, and sometimes one sentence creates shame. And that is how much words matter, which is why our role matters so much. We're often the first professional voice a new parent trusts, sometimes before the pediatrician, before the lactation consultant, before the online search at 2 a.m. We're there. Especially if you're in the hospital, especially. It's what we say in those early moments that plays again and again, that becomes the inner voice that they carry forward. Can you think, take a second here and close your eyes, open your eyes. We have that little note that we wrote down earlier, right? The time someone said something to you and you weren't sure how to respond. So I'd like to ask you to try to remember the first thing a professional said to you about feeding. And just think about that for a second. Is there something that someone said or that you heard and you just felt like you left with more questions than anything? And we can come back to that. We can talk about that after. But that is why this matters. Maybe you're a new mom, maybe you're a provider, maybe you're both. Often we can remember something that a professional said to us, especially about feeding, because of how we felt after. Did we feel awesome? Like, oh my gosh, I can do anything? Or did we feel less than? So, as providers, home visitors, maybe doulas, lactation coaches, counselors, consultants, as nurses, as women, as support people, resource providers, people that work in doctors' offices. We don't just provide information, we model support. It is how we talk. It's also how we respond, how we handle uncertainty, how we stay calm when things feel hard. People are learning from us, even when we're not actively teaching. They're learning what support looks like, or what compassion sounds like, or what safety feels like. And then that becomes their standard. That's pretty powerful. And part of what we do is often approached from an outcome standpoint, right? And what we want to think about here is that we do not have all the answers. And we were never supposed to have all the answers. Our job is not to control the outcome, it's to create conditions, right? We're creating conditions for trust. We're creating conditions for confidence. We're creating conditions for growth. We are not the outcome. We are part of the environment. And that shift matters because it also takes the pressure off of us. So then we can care without carrying. So how do we do that? How do we care without carrying? Well, we start by listening without fixing. So, public service announcement to all humans. Most of us are fixers. We hear a problem, we want to solve it immediately. And I say most of us, absolutely, it is me. I have worked really hard on this, and this is an active work in progress, very much so. Because fixing feels productive. Fixing feels helpful, it feels like care. Sometimes what someone needs most is not a solution. They need space. They might need to be heard, just feel heard. They may not want to be alone. They may not want to feel alone. Sometimes listening without fixing is a shift that feels so much bigger than any other piece of how we communicate, because it's one of the hardest things we do. We are trained to solve, and we are rewarded for having answers. So the idea that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is sit in discomfort with someone and say, I hear you. This is hard. I am here. This is hard. So something that I would like to offer, and this is just a moment of practice. If someone said to you, I just can't do this anymore. They're talking about breastfeeding. They just can't do this anymore. What do you say? What do you notice? What responses pop up in your head? To be honest, what's the first response? Because sometimes we have to filter that one out. Because we need to pause before solving, because sometimes solving isn't the answer. We want to ask before assuming, because Maybe they said, I just can't do this anymore. And you didn't know what this was, right? Does it mean school? Does it mean breastfeeding? Does it mean life? How about we stay before we step in? So we ask the questions, we pause, we listen, because trust is built in small moments. It doesn't usually happen in one big moment, it builds quietly over time. We show up, and then we show up again and again. And that consistency creates safety. It does not create perfection. It's not about one perfect visit, one perfect appointment, one perfect phone call. It's the consistency. People trust what feels predictable, what feels steady, what feels safe. And especially in postpartum care, safety matters more than a flawless delivery. Trust grows through repetition, through follow up, through remembering what mattered to them, through being present when it counts. Continuity of care, seeing the same provider. If you're a home visiting nurse, right, the same nurse shows up. If you're a person that reaches out and follows up with postpartum patients, having the same person regularly show up, regularly call, trust isn't just interpersonal, it's structural. So when systems support continuity, families are more likely to feel safe. They're more likely to ask questions, and often they're more likely to persist through challenges. So now let's widen that lens, because feeding is rarely just one person's experience. It, it may happen through one body. It may start with one body, but it impacts the whole family, right? Partners, support people, grandparents, older children. There's a ripple effect. And yet, often, the full responsibility of feeding the baby is often placed on one person, who is usually mom, which creates pressure and isolation and sometimes unnecessary guilt, because support works better when it becomes a shared responsibility rather than a silent expectation. So if we're looking at feeding as a family experience rather than an individual performance, that whole system is stronger together. When we think about it as a feeding, or the feeding as a family experience, well, how are other people experiencing it, right? How can it be a shared experience? How can it be just one person or not just one person? Well, sleep. Is everybody sleeping the same? How about stress? Because I know in my house, if one person is lacking sleep, there is more stress. It is not a one-to-one ratio either. It's exponentially lopsided. How about schedules, emotions, expectations, recovery, all of it? So again, when we're thinking about what that support looks like and what that responsibility could look like if it were shared, we want to identify what support is available within the family, within the house, within the community. When we're thinking about partners, there is often a partner present. And unfortunately, they're not always included. So if they are there and they are watching and they are wanting to help, trying to be supportive, and they have no idea what support actually looks like, maybe we pause and we say, or we think, right? We're curious here, some perspective. Maybe they're waiting for instructions, or maybe they're afraid to do the wrong thing. So if we don't include them, we may miss one of the strongest support systems available. I share this story sometimes. I've shared this before when We had our third baby. My husband used to get up in the middle of the night with us, with the baby and I. And I, again, I was trying to breastfeed, and he cries, we get up, we go in his room, and I just was the first one to pop up, that the mom ears, the mom brain. I get up, I go in, I change him, I sit down, I nurse him. My husband comes in, and he sits on the ottoman, and he's there. He's showing up for me. He wants to help. He doesn't know exactly what he needs to do because I've done all the things, but he wants to help, right? And I think we were maybe home just a couple weeks or so, and I said, "Could you please stop sitting on the ottoman?" And he said, "What?" Like, totally confused. And I said, "Well, I can't rock properly and position him properly when you're sitting on that." And he said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I want to help, and I feel bad that you're up, and I want to do something." So I said, "No, you know what? If you could get my water, and then if you could just go back to bed, because you have to work in the morning. So when you sit here with me, then I feel guilty that you're sitting here with me because you have to get up and work in the morning." And we can talk about that more later or after, or even in another session, because he was waiting for instructions. He thought he was helping. And if I hadn't said something, then he may not have known what I needed. Because what are partners carrying, right? They're carrying things too. They may be watching someone that they love struggle, and they don't know how to fix it. They may feel like they don't know how to help. They may feel confused because feeding advice can feel very overwhelming for everyone involved, right? I mean, there's not usually a lack of opinions out there. And then you take those opinions, and you take the education, and you take the advice, and then it adds layers of pressure to that person, because then they want to help. And typically they want to solve, and they want to protect. So even if they're totally, completely, they feel absolutely unprepared, they want to do all these things, because part of supporting families means that we need to recognize that partners need guidance too, not just observation. So, how do we include the partners? Because we want to make sure that we are able to offer support after we leave. So, if we include partners, the support continues after we leave. And that matters because we're not there at 2 a.m., they are. There's a shared understanding, if there's a shared understanding between two new parents, then there is a reduction in pressure. So, how do we create that? We want to include the partners. How do we include them? Well, we want to include them as much as possible during the time that we're all together, so that after we leave, that support remains, because that matters. We're not there at 2 a.m., they are. If mom and dad have a shared understanding of what is needed or what is wanted, then that shared understanding can reduce the pressure, and then their confidence will grow. Their communication may improve. Learning how to say, "Hey, babe, could you get me my water?" and then go back to bed is hard. And the burden stops feeling like one person is carrying everything, because we're not about creating helpers. Again, this is a shared responsibility, and there's a big difference in those two things. So, specifically, how can we include them? Well, support does not have to be dramatic, right? It might be handing mom water. It might mean take the baby after feeding, or handling a diaper change, protecting sleep so maybe mom can nap or shower, manage the dishes, making sure that somebody in the house eats, right? Ideally, everybody eats. And honestly, sometimes the most important support is emotional presence. It's not fixing, it's not solving, it's just being there. because that matters so much more than people realize. So let's go back to our list here, right? What support did you receive? What do you remember? What helped? What was missing? And if you're someone who hasn't had a child and you're a support person, what support did you provide that maybe you thought landed really well? Maybe you thought it was really helpful. And now you may reflect a little bit and think, oh, I think I could have said that differently. Right? What do families need most? Not theoretically or ideally, right now in real life. Because sometimes that answer is super simple. They need practical help. They need permission. They need someone to show up and say, you are not alone. Because that kind of support can change everything. If we could look at our list or don't look at your list, if you're with people or if you're by yourself, I would love for you to turn to a neighbor or text a friend that is also maybe in this conference and share a moment where feeding support made a difference, positive or negative. What I'd love for you to think about is, was there validation? Was there presence? Was it being heard? Was it negative where maybe someone didn't feel heard? Or maybe someone received information that was intended to be helpful and instead they felt guilty or they felt less than. So we've been talking about including partners, and I want to be clear, this isn't, me talking about my husband or like, this is fun, let's just talk about this. This is research. So in 2020, a researcher, Ogbo, and his colleagues published a systematic review in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. And they found that partner and father involvement in breastfeeding support was consistently linked to improved breastfeeding outcomes, including initiation, duration, and exclusivity, because partners are not bystanders. They are part of the system. In another study in 2024 in the International Breastfeeding Journal, they surveyed fathers specifically about their support needs. And most fathers wanted to help, but felt excluded from the feeding conversation. They wanted practical guidance. They did not want to just observe. They wanted to know what to do and not to just be told, oh, just be supportive. There are many other studies out there that talk to us about how people can be supportive. A lot of times, providers will intentionally include partners. And when that happens, the outcomes improve for the entire family. Because this is not about giving partners a checklist. It's about recognizing that support is a family system. So when we engage only one person, we leave the rest of the system without tools. And then isolation grows. So we've talked about feeding. We've talked about the moms. We've talked about our role. We've talked about partners. So now let's zoom out, because the support that we offer, the support we provide is bigger than one visit. It's bigger than one provider, because families are not experiencing a care or lack of care in separate pieces. They're not thinking, well, this is my feeding issue and this is my mental health issue and then this is my relationship issue. They're experiencing all of it at the same time. So when support feels disconnected, families feel it. They feel it in the gaps. They feel it in the silence after discharge. They feel it in conflicting advice. And then they feel it when they're trying to figure it all out alone. So this is where the systems matters, because good care isn't just about the information. It's the continuity, the connection. It's knowing where support lives after we leave. Because the hardest moments often happen after we leave. It's going back to those 2 a.m. feedings, the tears, the doubt, the conflicting advice from Google, ChatGPT, grandma, the internet, social media. The questions don't stop when the appointments end. In fact, they usually get louder. So if support disappears there at the end of the visit, families are going to feel it, which is why support beyond the visit matters. In a recent health forum in 2025 from JAMA, they highlighted that newborn visits represent critical but underutilized touch points for bridging postpartum care gaps. Because the period between hospital discharge and the first pediatric visit is when many feeding difficulties escalate, which is also when parents are most vulnerable. So structuring support around this window through follow-up calls, home visits, warm handoffs, all of these pieces can prevent crisis. Because again, looking at all of this, we're not separating these pieces. The families are living it all at the same time. So the feeding issue may be an exhaustion issue. Bonding issue or bonding concern may be anxiety. A non-compliant parent may be completely, utterly overwhelmed. So if we're only treating one piece, we're going to miss the real need. Whole person care matters because families aren't problems to solve. They're people trying to function. So when families are trying to function, and we know that that time between discharge and making it to that first visit is a really big struggle period, right? That's one of our biggest gaps. It's a combination of things, right? There's limited follow-up and or there's discharge without clarity. You've got that conflicting advice. It's adding emotional overwhelm on top of all of the questions, all of the ambiguity. And sometimes people leave the hospital with plenty of instructions and zero confidence. And instructions and confidence are not the same thing. So when support feels fragmented, families start filling in the blanks alone. And then that's where fear grows. So let's think about this. How can we connect families, right? Trusted referrals matter. So if a family feels like they're being handed off rather than being handed forward, their trust drops. Community collaboration matters, not just because it looks good on paper, but because continuity creates confidence. And when people feel safer, when support feels connected, when providers communicate, when advice aligns, next steps feel a little bit more clear. Confidence grows, and people know where to go next, and that matters. So, with our continuity of care, with our support, with our referrals, how do we arrive here? And it's meeting families where they are. Except meeting families where they are kind of sounds simple. And somehow it's also one of the hardest things that we can challenge ourselves to do. Because that means we need to let go of where we thought they should be. It's checking our own personal opinions and biases out the door. It's focusing on where they are right now, today, in real life, not based on ideal conditions, not textbook situations, real life. Real life that includes work schedules and limited sleep, maybe financial stress, mental load, relationship strain, all of it. Reality-based care is not lowering standards, it's making support possible. And when we talk about these gaps, the evidence is clear. There are many published systematic reviews that discuss the continuity of care in the postnatal period. Continuity of care, meaning consistent provider relationships across pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, improved breastfeeding rates and maternal mental health outcomes. Because when mothers felt like their care was connected, they did better across the board. Those newborn visits, those are critical touch points. And those critical touch points can be used to bridge postpartum care gaps. There are authors of several different studies that discuss how the first pediatric visit was one of the highest risk windows for maternal mental health. And yet somehow it is often the least supported. So think about that. We discharge families with instructions. But if no one follows up, the gap is real. The gap grows. The gap is where doubt grows. It's where isolation takes hold. It's where someone stops asking for help because they think they should already know. Continuity doesn't mean perfection. It means connection. It means follow through. It means that families know they aren't navigating this alone, even after we leave. Bringing this back, thinking about what we do and how we do it, what support gaps do families experience most in your work, in your community, in your caseload? Where do you notice people getting lost? Or where do they stop asking for help? Where does the system accidentally create more stress? And then, what is one phrase you can start saying differently today? Today, not next month, not after more training, today. Because small language shifts create big trust shifts. And that's where we can start changing the system. So, looking at our list, looking at our notes, our comments, what is something you heard? What is something someone needed? What is something that was helpful? We're creating this picture, almost like a care plan. We're saying, where are we? We know we want to help. And what can we do better? This is where we bring it all back. Because after the education, after we look at all the systems and all the strategy, we return to something very simple: people. Families don't remember every instruction. They don't remember every handout. They don't remember every perfectly worded explanation. They remember how they felt, how safe they felt, how seen they felt. And that's the work. It's not perfection, it's not performance, it's support, which is where we close. Because connection is not just ounces, exclusivity, and duration, right? We define it too narrowly sometimes. Did breastfeeding happen exactly the way we hoped? Did the plan stay the plan? Those things matter, but they're not the whole story. Because success is also connection, confidence, emotional safety, trust, feeling supported. And if someone leaves your interaction, your visit, your appointment feeling informed but ashamed, that's not success. We want them to leave feeling seen and supported. That's what we want success to look like. Because two things can be true. And this is one of my favorite reminders. Breastfeeding is valuable, and flexibility matters. Goals matter too, and so does reality. Plans matter, and life happens anyway. We don't have to choose just one truth and then reject the other, because both can exist. Both can be valid, and honestly, that mindset can create a lot more space, not just for families, for us. So leaning into progress over perfection, because not everything has to feel good. Honestly, sometimes better than bad is good enough, especially in postpartum life, especially in survival seasons, especially when people are exhausted and just trying to hold everything together. We don't always need to be perfect. Sometimes we just need to be stable. Sometimes we just need to feel that life is manageable. Sometimes we need just one less hard thing, and that counts because progress matters. Even when progress looks small or feels messy, even when progress is simply better than bad. Because as we come full circle in every visit, every conversation, it's how we listen, it's how we respond, it's how we create space, it's how we support growth. We're not the outcome. We were never meant to be the outcome. And we're not forcing growth, right? We're creating the conditions so that growth can happen, so that someone can move from bad to better than bad, so that someone can initially feel like maybe I'm not enough and then shift to, yeah, I am good enough today. Because that growth, that shift, that matters. And the way we do that, going back, is supporting, not fixing, right? Because we carry a lot too. We carry things that were never meant for us to hold, and definitely not to hold alone. Thinking, I need to fix this, I need to make this work, I need to make this better. We need to pause there because we want to offer that permission for progress over perfection for our clients. And we also need to create space for that understanding for ourselves because we don't need to fix everything. We don't need to make everything work. We don't need to make everything better. Maybe a better question is, how can I support this? How can I create space for this? How can I help someone else feel less alone? How can I feel less alone? Because we're not responsible for controlling every single outcome. We are responsible for support. We are responsible for offering support and receiving support. That's powerful. So we're thinking about our words, we're thinking about our actions and our body language, and we're thinking about what is working in our community and what isn't. We're thinking about what is something that was said to us that landed well or didn't land well at all. And after we left, we felt terrible. So pulling those pieces together, what is one seed that you've planted recently? What is one seed that you might trust to grow? Your work matters. Even when your work feels invisible, even when progress feels slow, even when you're not sure if anything is changing. Because maybe, especially then, that's when your work matters the most. Thank you so much. Make yourself a great day.